Welcome back, everybody. I'm Sharon Krause from the Political Science Department here at Brown, and I'm delighted to introduce our next set of speakers. We have Jay Bernstein from the New School of Social Research, who's going to speak on the concept of right, and Didier Fessin from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, who's going to talk about punishment.
So let me begin with apologies. The first apology is that I had promised lots of people that I was going to write on Etienne's great theorem for 21st century politics, that civility is an interruption of violence, which seems to me what our situation is now. And I didn't write that paper because I don't know how civility interrupts violence. That seems to me the exact problematic, and the consequence is I could not write that paper. I hope that that thought of asking the question, which I think is the deepest question of our political moment, how does civility interrupt violence, will come back. My second apology is that the talk I'm about to give is terribly mangled because it was a 15,000 word paper, and now it's 3,000 words of pasted together. So apologies if the argument seems mangled, because it is. I chose rights. The last thought here is not an apology. This is a thought experiment. Thought experiment about the notion of rights in Etienne's thought. And I thought it was important because I thought that if there is any concept now that is being thoroughly repudiated everywhere in every nation, it is the idea of human rights. That what we are looking at is the political rejection of that idea and ideal. We are watching the death of human rights. And I thought maybe at least I'll suggest why we ought to think about holding on to it. Because mangled, I'll begin with a roadmap, 7 theses. Balibar takes the French Revolution as declared in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen as instituting a new conception of the meaning of the being human. To be human is to be recognized as being a citizen. Thus, politics, rather than religion or metaphysics or science, now forms the horizon of the intelligibility of the meaning of being human. Thesis 2, the meaning of the human as being a citizen is achieved through the possession of equal legal rights, human rights. Call this is my thought, the rights character of the human. Balibar announces his thesis this way: the citizen, defined by his rights and duties, is that non-subject who comes after the subject, and whose constitution and recognition put an end, in principle, to the subjection of the subject. Thesis 3, all rights are claim rights, and the ground of rights claimed occurs through the activities of their being claimed. Having the title to claim rights constitutes the dignity and worth of individuals as individuals. Thesis 4, if for Balibar the proposition of equilibrity is the material a priori truth underlying the political project of modernity, and I take it Emily is going to convince us of that later? Yeah, maybe? Then the actuality of equilibrity is equal rights. Thesis 5, the ethical source underlying the political project of equal rights, which I think is what Etienne was talking about 10 minutes ago in terms of power and vulnerability, is the negative. He says his ethics is a negative ethics. It occurs through fundamental experiences of the destruction and suffering of the human as such. Hence, the political project of modernity operates through a negative dialectics, or more precisely, through the determinate negations of concrete forms of destruction, domination, abjection, and degradation. Rights are determinate negations of wrong. Thesis 6, call the value of the human as such dignity. If dignity is nothing metaphysical, nothing given, then human dignity is constituted by the possession of equal rights. Hence, equilibrity presupposes equidignity. Equidignity is my coinage. Cute, yeah, I know. Okay, and then thesis 7, connecting the experiences of the violation of any individual's dignity with the depredation of the human status as such. That's what I claim happens when there's a violation of an individual's dignity. There's a depredation of the human status as such, is the experience of our undergoing an anthropological revolution. That's Etienne's phrase, through which the human comes to be ethically and normatively experienced as constituted through the possession of rights. Hence, the rights character of the human. Okay, that's the argument in a nutshell. Here's now the mangled set of thoughts to support it. Let me begin with thesis 3. In order to understand the kind of function rights practices involve, it is helpful to begin with a simple thought experiment. Imagine two more or less identical worlds in each of which the material conditions of the populations are the same. Same levels of housing, nutrition, education, healthcare, etc. The only difference between these two worlds is that in one, people have rights, while in the other, they do not. Because the two worlds are materially identical, it follows that whatever the meaning and significance of rights are, rights do not a priori involve a fairer or more reliable distribution of material resources. Hence, the significance of rights is not that they provide a more efficient means or even a more just means for the distribution of goods. Joel Feinberg, and I take the classical analytic essay on rights, the nature and value of rights, whose thought experiment this is, names the second world, the one without rights, Nowheresville. In order to account for the material sufficiency of the less prosperous inhabitants of Nowheresville, we might conceive of their better-off neighbors as possessing duties imposed by positive law and/or authoritative morality obligating individuals or the administration of Nowheresville to take care of the basic needs of its inhabitants. These duties would not, of course, be duties owed to the beneficiaries, but duties to Nowheresville itself, or to God, or to the moral law that would be fulfilled through appropriate beneficent actions. Nowheresville is not far from how conservatives would prefer to conceive of welfare, namely as a paternalistic system of social protections conferred from on high to vulnerable individuals who are perceived as passive beneficiaries of social aid. Worlds without rights can be materially satisfactory and morally replete. Nowheresvillians can be conceived of as eminently virtuous, even great-souled, or in a Kantian register as morally punctilious about their imperfect duties to others. Lacking rights, what is absent from the architecture of ethical life of Nowheresville is only the capacity to make claims. Of course, a right is a kind of claim, and a claim is an assertion of right. On your handout, I've given you the dictionary definition of right, number 2. I'm not going to read it out, but it gives you the circle of rights and claims. What the comfortable circle between possessing a right and the ability to make a claim leaves out, Feinberg argues, is that claiming is an elaborate sort of rule-governed activity, and thus to comprehend the ethical significance of rights involves elaborating what is involved in the activity of claiming. Having rights makes claiming possible, but it is claiming, Feinberg argues, that gives rights their special moral significance. Claiming that one has rights is to insist upon one having rights, and having the right is being licensed to make a claim. Since rights idle when unrecognized, then the business of claiming that one has a right and making a rights claim to some good must be fiercely intertwined. One cannot make a claim to a good without at the same time claiming that one has a right to that good, and conversely, a claim that one has a right is the effective prelude to making a claim to some good. Claiming then, and this is the crucial thought, is a first-person activity through which an individual inserts herself into a social world as having normative authority that demands recognition and heeding, and further, in being a rights claim, claiming institutes the appropriateness and even necessity of such recognition and heeding. The point here is not simply that right claims are made in the first person. Rather, what the contrast with Nowheresville is meant to demonstrate, right claims generate the space for claiming, they invoke, and thereby institute the authority and therefore the worth of the first person as such. The worth, entitlement, and value of the first person are characteristics that emerge through an individual's own doing and effort, through their claiming, and what is claimed is the right to claim. Rights thus declare a putative egalitarian social framework that authorizes individuals, gives social authority to them as individuals with respect to their social fellows, and encompassing social institutional habitat. Since right is only actual in the claim, then claiming is necessary to the existence of a right. Hence, a right emerges through the claiming it founds. Without that way of knotting right and claim, claiming, instituting and actualizing the rights that ground the claim, the performative, practical character of claims that give them their moral significance is erased. It is in this sense that rights involve some conception of oneself as having equal worth or equal entitlement in some domain that leads Feinberg to wonder, and in this paper he just wonders, whether the notion of rights is not the key to the value of the human as such, a key to the very idea of human dignity. And I've given you that wonderful passage from his paper in number 3 on your handout, which I won't read out. We can talk about it later. Rights, I'm claiming, are constitutive of the dignity of the human. I haven't argued for that, I'm just saying it. Part 3, Nowheresville again. of natural rights and human rights. Balibar, both in his own voice and his defense of Hannah Arendt's account of rights, argues that both natural rights and human rights, as traditionally conceived, are versions of Nowheresville. Natural rights precisely dislocate individuals from social space, hence detach rights from the practice of claiming. The transcendent guarantee of rights empties them of their practical significance. Or it is the moralization of rights that deposits their holders in Nowheresville. So the reversal that he wants to operate right is that the idea of morally guaranteeing them is exactly the thing that undermines their political meaning, practice, and significance. Exactly agreeing now with Feinberg, I think. We must hence reconstruct the tradition of human rights that begins with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen as geared toward binding the possession of rights to the political work of claiming as what it means to finally exit Nowheresville, that is to put an end to the subjection of the subject. In a procedure that is patently, I think, an elaboration of Hegel, Balibar radicalizes the argument for the autonomy and primacy of politics from a phenomenological theorem, Arendt's procedure, to a constitutive epochal political project. Political action itself inaugurates and grounds the claim for the primacy of the political that commences with a groundless act of declaration. In Balibar's handling, the reversal from transcendence to immanence, from human rights as moral rights to political rights being the ground of human rights, is initiated by three moments. One, the moment of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Two, the identification of the rights of man with the rights of the citizen, or better, the inclusion of the rights of man in and as an element of the rights of the citizen. And three, the material a priori truth of the theorem of equilibrity. These three moments are best considered as three aspects of a singular act of political founding in which modernity constitutes itself as a distinct form of human living in the long and discontinuous history of societal experiments on the meaning of being human. I'm sorry, that's a kind of just Bernsteinian, Lukácsian thought. That's what I understand history to be, a series of experiments about what it means to be a human being. I take it what Lukács argued, and I just think he's right, and I think Balibar agrees. It is only in the light of these three moments that the universality of equal rights can come into view. Equal rights for Balibar manifest a definition of the meaning of human being in general, and it is that transfiguration in the meaning of the human that spells out the epochally constitutive character of the primacy of politics. To put the thesis most broadly and crudely, it is only through the epochal reconstitution of the human as a creature composed of legal rights that are indefinitely politically implemented, sustained, invented, and reinvented. That is the process through which the constitution of the polity is continually created and recreated through insurrection, that we can finally exit from the Nowheresville of theoretical transcendence, natural hierarchy, and social domination, and therefore equally from the reifications of natural rights and human rights. Balibar argues that the proposition of equilibrity, the proposition that liberty and equality are equal, is not a conceptual claim, but empirical and experimental. Freedom and equality are extensionally equivalent. Wherever there is a lack of freedom, then there will be a lack of equality, and wherever there is a lack of equality, there too will be a lack of liberty. Number 4 in your handout, the de facto historical conditions of freedom are exactly the same as the de facto historical conditions of equality. The proposition of equilibrity proposes an experiment in the idea of a form of life where it is taken, and I mean taken, to be the material a priori truth underlying our collective pursuits. The form of life projected by the proposition of equilibrity can only be an historical experiment because there are no obvious ways of demonstrating it directly. As Balibar underlines, a part of the logic of equilibrity is causal, social causality. The conditions in which there is a debilitating inequality are ones that bring about or depend on the deprivation of some liberty, and wherever there is a lack of needful freedom, there will be, it's a prediction, right, a cause that this will cause or be caused by a lack of equality. The material a priori truth of the proposition of equilibrity is what grounds the theorem of the primacy of the political. Because the rights of man and the rights of the citizen are one, then being a man and being a citizen are one. Even after the argument for the inclusion of the rights of man within the rights of the citizen, the further identification of being a man with being a citizen can, to some of us, still sound blisteringly wrong-headed and exorbitant. People are more than just citizens. Why claim we are essentially citizens? It seems kind of outrageous. Clearly, what makes the argument load-bearing, in my view, is the original inclusion of the rights of man within the rights of the citizen. Can the rights of the citizen intelligibly absorb the meaning of the human in this way? That's, I take it, the claim. Part 4, the rights character of the human, the right to have rights. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt offers an analysis of the destruction of the human in the camps, an account of how persons can have the very fabric of what makes them human undone, while yet they remain alive. Arendt contends that human beings can be destroyed in this way because human beings do not have an abiding essence. They do not have a metaphysical kernel of dignity that survives no matter what. They do not have a moral nature that is impervious to worldly events. Those are the metaphysical fictions of the human that Arendt spent her entire philosophical life undoing. Humans can have their humanity, their dignity, if you wish, taken from them because the human is a status, not a natural kind. That the human is a status that requires the work of an entire complex social world to hold it in place. Remove the fundamental structures of that world, make those beings worldless, Arendt's phrasing, and what remains is nothing human, nothing you would recognize as human. In the camps, those beings who had their humanity undone were called Musulmaner. After bearing witness to Arendt's account of the destruction of the human, Balibar remarks that it is in light of this analysis that we must separate Arendt's critique of human rights, including her emphatic institutional thesis that only the juridification of right can generate rights that have enforceable and therefore meaningful corresponding duties. We must separate that thought from the denial of natural rights one finds in Burke Bentham and later legal positivism. Arendt does indeed want to argue that if the destruction of civil rights entails the destruction of human rights, then in reality, the latter rest on the former, that human rights rest on civil rights. That is her concession to the tradition of Burke and legal positivism. But, number 5 on your handout, hers is a much more radical and philosophically opposite idea. Outside the institution of community, there are no human beings. Humans do not exist as such, and thus they are not, strictly speaking. If humans are destructible in their being human, then being human, again, is nothing natural, nothing you can find laying about the world as one finds coffee cups and tables and oak trees. The human is a status and an achievement, everywhere and always, only. The human is only a status and an achievement, and not a theological, metaphysical, or natural fact about the world. But this is not to surrender the claim of human rights. On the contrary, number 6 on your handout, Arendt does not intend to relativize the idea of human rights, but rather to make it indissociable and indiscernible from a construction of the human that is an internal, imminent effect of the historical invention of political institutions. We must say that, strictly speaking, this is where I got my idea from, it's not one that Etienne repeats often, but I love this sentence. We must say, strictly speaking, human beings are their rights. Wow. And they exist through them. Or they exist through them. Or. Elsewhere, number 6A on your handout, Balibar states the thesis this way: the recognition of social rights implies the emergence of a form of citizenships that makes their effective institution possible, and it is these rights that, as new fundamental rights, come to define the human. I see Etienne shaking his head. Does he believe that or not? He doesn't know. If we are not to disown or repudiate being human and the mutual recognition of rights that is a necessary condition for the recognition of the human, then the idea of human rights is indeed indissociable and indiscernible from the construction of the human under conditions in which politics has become the primary form of collective self-interpretation and collective self-determination. What other forms of collective self-interpretation ignored, the reason why they de facto installed humans in Nowheresville was their indisputable discovery, what they ignored was the indisputable discovery that being human is destructible. And what follows from that discovery, that being human is a status whose achievement is contingent. For some beings with a human form, it may never be fully achieved, and even after it is achieved, the human remains subject to devastation. Balibar parses this contingency and the necessity of the rights character of the human in terms of, and this is his interpretation of, Arendt's doctrine of the right to have rights. Balibar's deduction begins with the recognition of the contingency of right. Number 7 on your handout. Rights are not properties or qualities that individuals possess on their own, but qualities that individuals confer on one another as soon as they institute a common world in which they can be considered responsible for their actions and opinions. I should say that the right way of parsing that phrasing entails that although earlier peoples did not know they cared about rights, they did because they instituted common worlds, but not under the heading of rights. So I understand the idea of rights as not a novel phenomenon in the human, but the making explicit of what is implicit in the recognition of individuals in earlier forms of having a common world in which individuals share the idea of the common. Right? And in this, he's actually simply agreeing with Kelson's idea of a minimal society. That's another paper. On Arendt's accounting, this recognition is, again, not a positivist critique of the metaphysics of natural right, but an inference from the radical experience of the rightlessness of stateless persons. The right to have rights is consequent upon perceiving the connection between the rightlessness as a work of exclusion and rights as a product of mutual bestowal, because quite literally, number 8 on your handout, among the rights individuals are thus deprived of is the fundamental political right to demand or claim their rights, the rights to petition in the classical sense. In the condition of the statelessness and rightlessness, what becomes lost is the human power to claim rights, or even to claim as such, to make claims to a good, to make claims against others, to have one's claiming be a recognizable and meaningful intervention into a social space that can set things in motion, which is what rights do. Rights claims set things in legal motion. But to lack this singular possibility is to lack all that the possession of rights involves and entails. It is to lack any standing or status whatsoever as an individual in a social space. It is a form of social invisibility. Thus, number 9, the reciprocal thesis that follows from this is that the first right is precisely the right to have rights, taken absolutely or in its indetermination, and not some particular statutory right. Balibar titles the eruptive acts of politically claiming the right to have rights insurrection, or, in an equivalent of quieter locution, civil disobedience. The right to have rights is the right's character of the human in action, as politics. The right to have rights is thus a political recognition we bestow on one another as members of a rights community, a community composed not of likenesses, but of mutual rights, hence a community without community. Notice, I am here arguing that the concepts of insurrection, civil disobedience, and community without community, that I take to be fundamental concepts for Balibarian political theory, are simply a conceptual working out of the right to have rights as the nisus of the rights character of the human in general. Last section, the rights character of the human, equidignity. The political excess of the claim of right beyond every legal regime of rights is just the converse of the thesis that the authority of rights lives off the absence of right, that the demand for rights is the pained response to an even more brutalizing absence, that the positive is just the negation of a negation, hence the acknowledgement that the politics of right operates through and only through operations of determinate negation. So obviously I'm making Etienne a good Hegelian, which he may or may not welcome. Balibar, whimsically, I think, likes to state this thesis as the malgré lui truth of Nietzsche's theorem that all morality is a slave morality. What is helpful in this statement is its joining of ethical meaning to what has been negated, denied, excluded, discriminated against, undone, that is, to the condition of rightless lives, superfluous lives, disposable lives, and finally, to the reminder that each of these formations of hollowed out lives, lives that do not live, recalls, or if recall is required, what Arendt presents as the scene of the destruction as such in the camps. Because he rightly does not want to ground the possession of rights in an anterior metaphysical characteristic, nor in an anterior presupposed moral principle, Balibar is cautious in the extreme in his employment of ethical and moral vocabulary. His claim that the truth of the proposition of equilibrity is immaterial, yet absolute, is the perfect exemplar of his normative strategy. Nonetheless, if the human can be destroyed, and that matters, then something of value, either intrinsically or conditionally, has been destroyed. Although without emphasis, Balibar quietly, I think, accepts the idea that when a human is directly excluded from the human community, no matter how, they suffer a wrong, a moral injury. And that the most natural way to express that thought is to say they have suffered a violation to their dignity. So here is my broad hypothesis. First, if the idea of dignity is simply the placeholder for the idea of the intrinsic worth of individuals, then when a human is destroyed, then it is their dignity that is destroyed. That when a human is excluded, discriminated against, or dominated by another, there occurs a violation to their dignity. That when we perceive another treated with disrespect, we experience their intrinsic worth, the intrinsic worth of the human as such, as being violated, their dignity being violated, and hence at the same time, the worth of the human as such depredated. The destruction or violation of dignity is the ethically charged negative moment that is directly capable of being experienced and reacted in response to. But second, since the human is destructible, then we know that dignity is nothing metaphysical or natural. Indeed, we know that human dignity is itself just a status. A status of what? A status of being counted equal, of equal intrinsic worth with all others. So if dignity is a status that is destructible, then it will follow for us that the possession of equal rights is constitutive of human dignity. That's all there is to it. We construct the idea of dignity through constructing those rights that are necessary for us in response to our indeterminate sense of violations of wrong, our acknowledgement of the vulnerability of the other. And hence that here and now, having equal rights is the necessary condition for the possibility of achieving dignity in the modern world. If the possession of dignity expresses the intrinsic value of the human, and the possession of equal rights constitutes the possibility of achieving dignity, then the possession of equal rights is the constitutive condition of being human. This is what it means to speak of an anthropological revolution in which the rights character of the human installs the meaning of being human, here and now, for us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Didier.
Thank you. I took the liberty to examine a concept, punishment, that is probably not typically present in Etienne's work, at least as far as I know. And this might be the liberty or privilege of the non-political theorist. But I hope you will find in this essay something of Etienne's thought, something of its spirit, critical work, and of its letter, adding a fourth term to the triptych of his text on violence, ideality, and cruelty. So why punishment as a political concept? Indeed, as a concept, it has been mostly discussed by moral philosophers and legal theorists who have defended the importance of distinguishing between definition, supposedly value neutral, and justification, definitely value-laden, between the institution of punishment in general, viewed as justified, and the act of punishing in particular, possibly subject to criticism, between backward-oriented consideration about punishment, deontological or retributivist, and forward-oriented arguments, consequentialists or utilitarian. In fact, there are two sorts of reasons why the concept should be politicized, rather than being contemplated only from moral and legal perspective. The first reason is structural. Punishment largely has to do with a particular arrangement of power, sovereignty, authority, repression, violence, and the state. Of course, it can also be inflicted by a father on his disobedient child or by a teacher on an unruly student. But the remarkable fact in that regard has been the contrast between the increase in the intolerance towards physical and even moral retribution in the family or at school, and the acceptance of ever tougher public policies against offender. A contrast which attests to the expansion of the state monopoly over the legitimate use of punishment. The second reason is historical. In recent decades, most countries in the world have gone through a unique punitive moment. I use the term moment in reference to a period during which a spectacular extension of the domain of punishment has occurred independently of a rise in crime, but also as a dynamic, as suggested by the etymology of the word, which has been maintained with the term momentum. What characterizes the punitive moment is this singular configuration in which punishment, the putative solution to the problem of crime, has increasingly become the problem itself due to its consequences in terms of social exclusion, community destructuring, soaring incarceration costs, and ultimately increased crime recidivism. With almost 7 million people under the supervision of the correctional system, more than 2 million of those being imprisoned, and this number having been multiplied by 8 in 30 years, the United States offers the most extreme illustration of this phenomenon, and that should not improve in the next 4 years. And in fact, I should say that was my first thought on the morning of 11/9. But statistics collected since the 1990s at a global level indicate that the trend is worldwide, notably in France, where I've done my research on police, justice, and prison, with only a few exceptions, such as most of Scandinavian countries. In light of these two reasons, structural and historical, the concept of punishment can be deemed intrinsically and circumstantially political. In Violence, Ideality and Cruelty, a lecture delivered in Françoise Héritiers' seminar at the Collège de France in January 1995, Etienne Balibar notes that one German word, Gewalt, ambivalently corresponds to both power and violence, this conflagration of meanings being revealed by the very translation in other languages. In the same way, I suggest that the English term punishment equivocally refers to what the French would express with three notions. Punition is the most mundane and generic form. Châtiment has a religious or literary connotation. Peine belongs to the juridical and technical language. Here again, the translation unveils the polysemy of the term. This polysemy should not be seen, however, as an obstacle to the comprehension of punishment, but on the contrary, as a condition to it. My critique of the prevalent liberal theories of punishment, whether by philosophers or jurists, precisely resides in the fact that this foundational ambiguity is rarely acknowledged, which allows most authors to implicitly limit punishment to its legal sense of the French peine, and thus adopt a normative approach at the expense of a critical one. Reciprocally, it is their tacit use of this restrictive sense that generates their misunderstanding of my alternative reading of punishment, as they consider my utilization of the term to be too extensive. The most widely accepted definition of punishment, derived from H.L.R. Hart's famous 1959 prolegomenon to the principles of punishment, provides 5 decisive criteria: the infliction of a pain or an unpleasant equivalent to an actual or supposed offender in response to an offense against legal rules that is intentionally imposed by legal authority and administered by human beings with appropriate roles. Although the definition is presented as being independent from any justification, it assumes that punishment is both legitimate, since it sanctions an offender for the offense he has committed, and legal, since it is applied under the law for a violation of the law. Actually, Hart himself had called attention on the risk of what he called a definitional stop that would restrain our questioning of punishment. But this important caveat has not really been taken into account by later theorists who have mostly focused on the justification while simply using his definition as their starting point. Even social scientists often adopt it, such as David Garland in his theoretical sum on punishment, for methodological reasons perfectly grounded, but problematically exclusive. For my part, I want to challenge this definition on 3 counts. First, it purposely ignores non-legitimate and extra-legal expressions of punishment. Second, it questionably takes for granted the centrality of suffering in the administration of punishment. And third, it wrongly presupposes a just and fair distribution of punishment. These 3 criticisms are crucial for the apprehension of punishment as a political concept. But this discussion of the commonly accepted definition stems from what I would define as a more general epistemological position regarding the relation of the social sciences to their objects. Indeed, when studying a social fact, one option consists in circumscribing it precisely from the outset through a definition so as to try to recognize it in the real world. Whereas the other, conversely, privileges its progressive emergence from fieldwork through conversations with actors and observation of action. In the first case, the social fact is thus constructed a priori from the author's viewpoint, while in the second, it is established a posteriori from the agent's perspective. One may call the former approach Durkheimian and the latter Weberian. The choice of one method rather than the other may have significant political implications. In my view, a critique of punishment definitely implies a comprehensive perspective based on empirical work which allows for an understanding of punishment as it is rather than as it should be. So what is in a definition? The typical situation that moral philosophers and legal scholars have in mind when they use their definition of punishment is that of a judge deciding in court the sentence to be given to an offender as a retribution for his offense, which is thus established and punished under the law. It corresponds to the official version of punishment as legally grounded, legitimately imposed, and fairly distributed. And this is certainly a common configuration, but not by far the most frequent. Let us consider an institution that does not have for mission to punish, but does it routinely and extensively, the police. In quantitative terms, just as an example, in quantitative terms, their punitive actions are decidedly more numerous than those of the justice system. And just as an example, in the United States, the number of individuals killed by law enforcement agents is 40 times higher than the number of persons executed as a result of a legal process. Actually, as I realized while carrying out an ethnography of anti-crime brigades in the outskirts of Paris during 15 months, policing has become the most ordinary mode of retribution experienced by many individuals, especially those from ethno-racial minorities belonging to the working class and living in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Punishment by law enforcement officers takes multiple forms: harassment through stop and frisk, bullying via insults and threats, humiliation by offensive comments and public handcuffing, gratuitous arrests and taking into custody, physical brutality and moral violence. It involves presumed offenders as well as mere bystanders, in good part on the basis of ethno-racial profiling. In other words, it is not necessary that the person punished be guilty of any specific violation of the law. Their culpability is assumed on generic features such as appearance and residence. Two telling illustrations of the disconnection between criminal activity and retributive action are punitive expeditions and random punishment. In the first case, It is the whole group, for instance, the inhabitants of an apartment block in a housing project, who are the victims of the excessive use of force, being pushed, thumped, or pinned to the ground, and when house search is conducted, having their doors broken and furniture overturned. In the second case, random punishment, it is anyone in the group, usually the slowest runner or the least lucky passerby, who gets beaten up and arrested in place of the culprit. One could dispute the fact that these can be considered punishment. Are these acts not plain abuse of power, sheer domination, pure repression? When it is in response to an offense against the police, is it not simply reprisal? Some have tried to differentiate these terms, often with good theoretical or moral reasons. Thus, Robert Nozick establishes a clear distinction between retribution and revenge. It is analytically evaluable with 5 proposed criteria to differentiate the two, while also ideologically oriented, as it separates us, civilized, who punish, from them, barbarians, who avenge. But empirically, the distinction is often difficult to make and ultimately serves to legitimize or delegitimize the infliction of pain. How to decide then when a given practice can be regarded as punishment? In fact, 2 kinds of argument may be used. One, subjective, refers to the meaning given by the agents to their action. The other, objective, concerns the interpretation the analyst can make of the course of action. In the case of police aggressive behavior toward given publics, both arguments strongly speak in favor of punishment. First, the agents consider it as such. This is true in particular for the officers themselves. It is not only a question of masking reprehensible practices of vengeance by fear of consequences from their hierarchy. They do find rational justification for their acts. On the one hand, they indiscriminately regard those they handle in this way as actual enemies and potential criminals. Mistreatment is therefore just desert. On the other hand, they systematically view judges as being too lenient toward the suspects that they arrest. Justice in the street becomes then a substitute for the magistrate's supposed indulgence. Neither justification is, however, factually grounded, since opinion polls indicate that a majority of people, including in housing projects, has a favorable views about the police and even tries to collaborate with them, while penal statistics show that judges are increasingly severe in their sentencing, especially with respect to petty crime typically committed by lower classes. In any case, for law enforcement agents, there is a moral justification to what they deem just punishment, although most people would describe it as violence. This justification serving often to cover up racist prejudices and discriminatory practices. Second, objective. The institution also participates in this interpretation. Especially revealing is the fact that over the past 2 decades in France, the offense of insulting an officer and resisting arrest has skyrocketed. As the agents and their superiors themselves admitted to me, this incrimination corresponds to a situation of police misconduct, either through verbal provocation or use of excessive force. In particular, when the individual is injured, the accusation of insulting an officer and resisting arrest becomes a legal instrument for a preemptive counterattack in case of complaint for police violence. During the trial, it is the word of the sworn-in agent against the word of the alleged suspect. There is therefore a double punishment, first physically on the spot, then legally in court. The institution forcefully backs this practice as the Minister of the Interior encourages officers to file complaints and request financial compensation, and even pays for the lawyers. This is part of a broader policy that uses law enforcement as an instrument to enforce a social order in disadvantaged neighborhoods and among low-income populations in the name of the war on crime. Such illegal, illegitimate, and unfair practices serve to inculcate the concerned individual their place in society. They simultaneously produce political subjection and subjectivation. The state of emergency declared after the 2015 attacks has given more discretionary power to the police for their targeted punitive practices. If we accept these premises, such police interventions involve an institution that has no legal authority to punish and does punish outside the law, using ethno-racial profiling for stop and frisk or unjustified and disproportionate physical force for arrest. Moreover, they affect individuals who are at most suspect and frequently not even so, but simply belong to stigmatized and dominated categories, and they often do not have the pretext of an offense having been committed, since it is merely a routine behavior. In other words, most of the criteria defining punishment in the legal tradition are absent from the actual practices of punishing by law enforcement agents. Of course, such practices are specific neither to the French police nor to the police in general. A more systematic examination of the multiple expressions of state violence exerted against certain individuals or groups in various countries with retributive intentions would show that punishment often considerably exceeds its classical definition. And we can think, for example, of Israeli punitive policies and practices in the occupied territories of Palestine being an extreme example of that. In fact, only one criterion of this classic definition seems to resist the empirical test, and that is the infliction of pain as a retribution for something that does not have to be an offense, but can simply be what those targeted represent, that is, the form of otherness that they embody and the suspicion associated with it. So that punishment would in last instance be reduced to the imposition of suffering, be the method flogging, imprisoning, or shaming, is probably the least questioned fact about punishment among theorists as well as laypersons. The avoidance of this questioning comes down to a denial of two crucial facts. Far from being universal, this reductio ad dolori, so to speak, is temporally and spatially circumscribed. And far from being accidental, it is telling of profound truth rarely acknowledged. So let me examine these 2 points. So first, punishment has not always and everywhere corresponded to the infliction of pain. In most societies until a recent period, the commission of a reprehensible action called for a collective response in terms of compensation, generally material. Etymologically, as has been shown by Émile Benveniste, Greek poine and classical Latin poena, from which the word punishment stems, referred to the debt that had to be paid to atone for the crime. Only in late Latin did the connotation of torment appear, and it remains explicitly present in the word pain, which has the same etymology. Similarly, Latin retribuere, which later gave the noun retribution, meant to give in exchange and to restitute what is owed, whether it implied recompense or penalty. Interestingly, at the time of the Renaissance, under the differentiated religious influence, English retribution came to have the negative sense of punishment for a wrong, whereas French rétribution took the positive meaning of a fair salary rewarding work. Beyond this philological discussion, it is notable that historical findings from ancient worlds, as well as ethnological accounts from pre-colonial societies, attest to the generalized practice of reparation. Thus, Georg Simmel discusses Vergilt, which was the sum required to repair crime in Anglo-Saxon England, while Claude Lévi-Strauss mentions similar practices in the form of reparation among contemporary Plains Indians. For the Western world, Christianity at the end of the Middle Ages and for traditional societies, colonization in the modern era, radically transformed the moral economy of punishment from a dominant logic of exchange into a dominant logic of suffering. In the response to the crime committed, the pain inflicted on the offender replaced the debt owed to the offended or his relatives. Most importantly, whereas the payment of the debt previously involved a collective obligation for the clan or the family, the infliction of pain henceforth signified the individual liability of the culprit. Now, the second element, the fact that punishment amounts to the imposition of suffering, suggests more troubling truth. As noted by Durkheim, the act of punishing often seems to include, quote, an additional torment that serves no purpose, with a motivating force which is entirely emotional. By why would that be? Why should the judge humiliate the accused with hurtful remarks and embarrassing lectures before sending them to jail, to the point that when I would meet one of them later in his prison cell, he would tell me that in court he could not wait for the end of the trial, even when he knew this meant his incarceration? Why would police officers purposely put the handcuffs the wrong way around to a suspect they have arrested, so as to painfully twist his arm and make fun of his complaint while taking him into the precinct for questioning? Why would a corrections officer refuse a shower to an inmate and ostensibly let another take one after they have practiced sport in the yard? I intentionally use here mundane illustrations, avoiding much more dramatic or tragic cases resulting in the death of an individual in the hands of the police or correction officers. This excess in the practice of punishment has been interpreted by Nietzsche in the most explicit and powerful manner as, quote, the voluptuous pleasure de faire le mal pour le plaisir de le faire. In the assimilation of punishment with suffering, and even more in the unnecessary torment that is added to it, one cannot not recognize the manifestation of bare cruelty. Such ruthlessness is not, as is often argued, the fact of outliers, of cynical judges or sadistic officers. It is not the exception, it is part and parcel of retribution. In fact, society delegates to certain institutions and certain professions the power to mete out punishment so as to be in excess of what it is supposed to be. Typically, a prison sentence is never only a deprivation of liberty. It is also a deprivation of autonomy, of privacy, of affective and sexual life, of the right to decide on the most personal facts and ordinary events of life, and ultimately, in most cases, for lack of work, education, and rehabilitation, it is a deprivation of the very meaning of the punishment. The culmination of cruelty is solitary confinement, which is a punishment within the punishment, and unbounded torment added to the normal infliction of pain that concerns 80,000 inmates at any moment in the United States. So to understand how punishment can escape its official definition and exceed its determined limits, how extra-legal and non-legitimate retribution is normalized, how suffering is imposed with little restraint, one has to take into account a dimension that has maybe not received the attention it merits in classical theory, that is the distribution of punishment. It is because certain individuals and certain groups are more easily targeted that, for them, such exception may become the rule, that policing may be an ordinary mode of punishing them, and that the infliction of pain may seem justified in their case as a form of retribution. The distribution of punishment across society is, however, obscured by the fact that the differentiation of offenders appears to be a mere differentiation of offenses. It is not that African Americans are more harshly punished, the champions of law and order policies contend. It is that they commit more crime deemed punishable. Indeed, the question, who is punished, is strictly linked to another, what gets punished. Michel Foucault has shown how the distribution of punishment is the consequence of the differentiation of illegalisms. Not all offenses are treated in the same way. Today, tax evasion is socially better tolerated than shoplifting. In many countries, financial crime is settled through negotiation leading to fines for the company, whereas petty crime is settled through plea bargaining leading to prison sentences for the accused. The explicit differentiation of illegalism is itself in large part conditioned by an implicit differentiation of populations in terms of their punishability. That is, the social inclination to punish their deviant practices. But whereas Foucault tends to link the selective severity in the 18th and 19th century with the economic impact of illegalism, robbery being apparently more damaging to capitalism than fraud, I would argue that in contemporary society, it is rather the moral evaluation of perpetrators that is at stake, the undesirability of ethno-racial minorities, immigrants, and the poor, rendering them definitely more punishable a priori. More than the quality of the offense, it is the quality of the offender that explains the intolerance of society towards certain illegalisms rather than others. Dominated categories are those deemed punishable. They are those for whom punishment can be something different from what it is supposed to be. In the French short-stay prison where I conducted an ethnography, Black and Arab men represented 2/3 of the inmates, while half of them were jobless. During the 4 years of my research, the number of prisoners increased by 1/5 as the facility became more and more overcrowded. Against the centennial legal principle in France of single-cell housing, most cells were occupied by 2 inmates, although their 9 square meters were designed for 1 person. The indignity of the prison system reflects the assessment of their occupiers' worthiness. The hierarchy of population translated into a hierarchy of illegalism ultimately produces an unequal distribution of punishment, not only in quantitative terms, the overrepresentation of ethno-racial minorities and socioeconomically disadvantaged, but also in qualitative terms, the carceral condition being an indication of it. So to conclude, punishment is not what it is said it is. Both common sense and theoretical discourses tend to represent it in a way that not only justifies it on utilitarian or retributive grounds, but also legitimizes it as an institution that is necessary for the common good and the social fabric. The empirical examination of punishment does not confirm this representation. Refusing to adopt a normative stance regarding the justification of or legitimacy of punishment, my argument is that what is assumed to justify and legitimize it is simply unfounded. The critical approach I have tried to develop has therefore proceeded in 2 steps. First, the confrontation of the norm with its implementation revealed the discrepancy between the two. Punishment exceeds its definition, its illegal use is normalized, its social distribution is unfair, its equivalence with the infliction of pain is problematic. Second, the interpretation of this discrepancy unveils its logics. The determination of punishable populations as for counterpart the impunity of others, both processes being made opaque via an apparently neutral hierarchy of crime. Punishable populations correspond to undesirable social categories, both economically and ethno-racially, whose alleged unworthiness renders possible their mistreatment by the repressive institutions. Punishment, as a political concept, is therefore better understood not in terms of justice, but in terms of unequal allocation of power relations and social resources. Thank you.
Okay, we've got about 20 minutes for discussion. We can go 25, okay. And I will do what Amanda did and keep a queue, so catch my eye. I'll keep it roving, and let's assume that you don't have to be at the table to get on the queue. It's a big table. Okay, so I see Gary, Stathis, Elizabeth, Suzanne. Okay, so Gary, why don't you start and keep your hands up until I nod at you so I know.
I have a question for Jay. Thank you. I really appreciate the, what I would call, you're pointing out the radical humanism in both Arendt and Balibar, though we can talk more about that. My question is about state and community. At the beginning of your conversation about rights and dignity and claims, the state and the community seem to be given, presupposed in a certain way. And then as you went on and talked about the kind of mutual recognition within a common world and the project of making a common world, and as you talked about this wonderful attempt by both Arendt and Balibar to kind of invite us to think about community without community, it seemed that there's the prospect of that radical humanism that calls the state into question in a certain way and raises all kinds of questions about like the scale or the form of the civic or the community, which is the basis, right? The non-metaphysical, non-transcendental basis of this. So I was just wondering, like, you didn't mention state, so I was just wondering about that.
Thank you. So, of course, that was the question I was going to ask Etienne. But it's the right question, but I think the right response to it is the answer. I mean, first of all, the claim is human rights. He thinks of it as citizens of the world. He uses that phrase at some point. So the idea is without boundaries. And I take it, the thought is, his thought is to ask the question about what forms of political institutions do we need to invent and generate? What forms of insurrectional action are necessary for that acknowledgement? That is, it cannot take the state as given because the state is consistently, Mr. Trump, I'll mention his name, right, wants to put up walls, right, and generate who can be included and excluded, do the violation of rights at every moment, right? So the idea that that notion of boundary, right, is a form of exclusion and a form of creating disposable lives, right, means that the state cannot be the sole repository of rights. What forms there are, for me, are just like the question of what forms of, think of Piketty on taxation. We need taxation across states, otherwise we're not going to have effective, right, ways of controlling. So I think this is a matter of political invention, and therefore nothing could have been more disabling for the project than the very fast Brexit and the desire for people to follow suit and all the temptations now to fold back into state forms. Hence, I take it state forms are precisely the repudiation of rights.
Okay, so I'm going to ask people to, as much as you can, keep your comments quick. We've got a lot of people on the queue. So far I have Stathis, Elizabeth, Suzanne, Bernard, Bonnie, Emily, Judith, you in the striped dress, Katie, Anne, Susan, and Michelle. If you want to be on and I didn't. Everything. Let's go one at a time for now so we can take some depth.
Yeah,
and then,
why don't you take 3 or 4 at a time?
who do you want? Okay, yeah, so we'll, okay. Good, so we'll do, let's do two at a time. And so that's Stathis and Elizabeth.
Okay, I don't have a mic, but doesn't matter.
Oh, here.
Okay, this is for Jay. I have a question that emerges from agreement, and I have a disagreement. And the disagreement is a little embarrassing because it's a disagreement over the interpretation of Balibar, and it's embarrassing to be arguing about someone in someone's presence. My mother would scold me for disregarding a certain savoir-faire, but there you go. So the disagreement basically it would be that I think that you may be overstating if not identity quite, the equation between concepts, whether it is certainly between human and rights, but also I would say, for example, the quotation from Etienne's work, the de facto historical conditions of freedom are exactly the same as the de facto historical conditions of equality, does not mean that equality and liberty do not do different historical work.
Absolutely.
So, okay. But that raises an issue about these things which I see as identities, and I could be taking it wrong. So, of course, I entirely agree that because the human is a status, you said, a condition, a state, and not nature, for that reason, in fact, its properties can be removed, and so the human can be dehumanized, taken out of the world, as you said, in more ways than one. You can be killed. But it seems to me that, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this, that this occurrence, let's say this kind of subtraction of whatever are the attributes of the human from the human, the annihilation of the worldliness of the human, is paradoxically a human action, perhaps a human attribute, maybe we can say, which means that whatever may make the human an achievement, as you said, would have to include some of the basest and most horrific elements of indignity and destruction imaginable. Which means that then the phrase, again, I'll go back to Balibar's own words, we must say that, strictly speaking, human beings are their rights or exist through them, and he shook his head when you read it, might also be said, this would be my claim, that human beings are also the deprivation of their rights, in fact, or the human beings exist through their wrongs. I say this because there is a certain disjunction at the core of these entwinements, and it's a series of concepts of this kind that he uses. There's a certain disruption between, let's say, humans and rights and equality and liberty, which I think prevents the entwinement from becoming oneness. And this is crucial as far as I'm concerned to reading these texts.
Very quick comment for Jay's presentation. In the 60s and 70s, as some people know, there was an organization called the National Welfare Rights Organization, and it made a big impression on me because they had their national conference here at Brown. It was a great moment. I Googled them, and there are 4 goals. They're stated 4 goals. 1, adequate income. 2, dignity. 3, justice. 4, democratic participation. So they must have read Balibar.
So it's not historically true that every being with a human form who is destroyed has had their dignity destroyed. That's a political decision. That universality is not a fact. That would be the natural kind claim. That the thought that what we want to count as human in terms of value, right, is to see, to recognize certain acts of destruction as destruction of the human. So that only comes to be destruction of the human in light of, right, making a certain tie between the human form and the normative claim of the value of that form. So that universality seems to me an invention and a decision, and it's political. And other things have been called or claimed to be human or part of human life throughout history. But this claim is, how are we now here going to cash out our sense of the value of a human life, right? So of course, there have been lots of things that have been human, but this is a normative claim about how certain lives come to count and therefore be valued in certain ways. So only under this horizon do base acts count as base. Otherwise, they could be as the worst thing, I've just removed some garbage. And you can say it's all too human, but now you've bought into the normative claim. So that only rises, that way of thinking about it already presupposes the normative claim I'm making. And I'm glad we need to get these things back, absolutely.
Okay, so the next cluster of three, Suzanne, Bernard, and Bonnie.
Okay, a question for each of the speakers, and I'll try to be really, really brief. And for Jay, for you, you know, could you say a little bit more about how you're thinking of the relationship between rights and claiming? Because I can think of plenty of situations where claiming has absolutely no right, yeah, but I mean, but there is a way in which it seems to me that that performative movement of claiming is what gets us out of, or Brexits us out of Nowheresville.
That's right.
And I mean, you say it is that moment, that performative moment of making a claim. And so I'm not sure what then, or how you're then thinking about the relationship to that, to rights. And for Didier, you know, I gather from what you're saying that there is something in punishment that is more than itself. There's a kind of supplement to punishment, and at some point you said it's something emotional, and I mean, one thinks immediately, of course, of cruelty or sadism or something like that. But, you know, a term that I sort of came up with listening to you was punitivity. In other words, it's that the act of punishment is constitutes by that very act also the subject of punishment, who exists by virtue of his or her punitivity. And so maybe you could just say something more about that.
Okay, so I hate to spoil the wedding, but we were talking about the right to punish, And I heard Didier as a kind of direct challenge to everything you said, Jay, as a complete rebuke of everything you were saying. Because what he was doing was politicizing the right to punish and effectively showing that punishment is based on rights, and that mass incarceration today is the product of the enforcement of rights, of the rights to safety, to security, to be free in one's person from being assaulted, domestic abuse, sexual assault, to be free from having one's children influenced by drug peddlers in front of the school, right? That everything about mass incarceration and about punitiveness is about the enforcement of human rights. and civil rights. And so I really felt that there was a conversation here that needs to be had, because I think that also in your articulation of the human rights, you didn't take into account kind of the Sam Moyne's arguments about the way in which the genealogy of human rights is one that effectively displaced other ideologies, socialist, et cetera. And all of the kind of critique of rights that's existed both in the kind of legal theoretical context, at the civil rights context, and at the human rights context. So, I mean, the question would be, you know, what do we do with that? How do we address that? And then to Didier, it would be, do we use rights in that struggle, right? Because, I mean, to a certain extent, you moved us away from rights, but then do we use rights, and do we just use them instrumentally, right? Habeas corpus, whatever. We just throw them around as we do in court in order to achieve the ends that we want to achieve.
Okay, so my question is for Didier. I thought that was an amazing paper. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. It was a compliment. I'll say it louder. I thought Didier's paper was an amazing paper, and I'm thanking him for it. Jay's too, but my question is for Didier. So I have a couple of questions really about, just a couple of points about the kind of grand narrative, the background history that you tell to motivate the criticality of punishment now. And you're drawing on Benveniste here, I know, and others, but you talked about how the moral economy of punishment goes from exchange to suffering. This is in Benveniste, I believe. But I wanted to say that it arguably goes from suffering to exchange and back to suffering. If you think about the first punishment of Adam and Eve, the punishment is that they will suffer. You know, that he will have to labor with difficulty and she will have to labor with difficulty, suffering. And this, I mentioned this to make it not so linear and to make it maybe a little bit more difficult for us. And of course, we're still operating within the inherited tradition of this original sin. And then the next thing that you mentioned that I also wanted to ask you about is this distinction between, following on this, between the collective obligation that has to be righted, you know, the harm against the community, versus the individual liability. The first one is the more exchange orientation, and the second one grounds the move to suffering. And that just put me in mind of a pretty obvious text in this context, maybe, which of course is Merchant of Venice, in which the promised payment is a pound of flesh, which means that its collection will enact suffering, but it unites these two things that you are distinguishing, or that the people that you're drawing on are distinguishing. And the plea is to create what you're referring to throughout, which is a substitution, right? That you want to substitute payment for suffering is the civilized move. But the refusal of the substitution occurs partly because it doesn't make sense to talk about substitution, because the debt that is the debt that has been promised is the flesh. So it's not that there is exchange and he wants suffering, but that the exchange was the promised suffering, which I think goes back to the first question in terms, of course, of him being a Jew. The last question is a little bit different. It's not about your grand narrative. It's about something I would like to hear your thoughts on. And that has to do with the great work that you did in the paper of elaborating the idea of punishment as a kind of technique of governance or unjust governance. In the US, in any case, when we want to make claims against this kind of policing by way of street justice, which I think is a great way to think of this, we try to enact accountability, and the resistance to this accountability, of course, has many dimensions. I only want to mention one, which is that the police are going to be the last group in this country that is allowed to have a union, and their union is very powerful. So any attempt, you know, they have an infrastructure and an organization, and everyone else is an individual trying to claim a right, a voice in the wilderness, and they have this power too on top of every other policing power that they have. So I wanted, it's state-like, their structure. They have leadership, they have elections, they have dues, they have fees, they have everything. Before we even talk about the fact that they have guns, they have everything. So I wanted to know what you think about the possibility of enacting accountability in that, when we think of that part of the context, which might be the only part of the context that you did mention in your great paper. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So yes, my argument is at dual level that punishment is in excess of its definition, but it's in excess of itself also. So in excess of its definition, of its classical definition, as I tried to show, but also, and that's what I brought the question of cruelty and pleasure in excess of itself, and that's why putting people in prison is always more than what it is supposed to be, that is strictly a deprivation of liberty. And the question, if I understand well, the point of punitivity has to do perhaps both at an individual level and at a collective level to what Bernard was alluding to, which is the right to punish. So the fact that some are entitled or feel entitled to punish others. And that can be states, I gave an example, and that can be professions or institutions, I gave other examples. So I think that's a very important point to raise. What, I don't have this easy answer, but to reverse the question of punishability to punitivity or the right to punish or the entitlement to punish, which goes on the side of the dominant rather than dominated. So do we use rights to contest or to respond to this situation that I've described, punishment? I would say yes and no. I would say, and taking your argument from Sam Moyne to make it simply, that is, you can certainly use rights and human rights, and that can be an effective instrument to defend a cause in this case, as long as human rights or the claim for human rights in these cases does not elude the question of social justice, which was in your point. So I think it's the combination or the combination of the two. So not just at an individual level of the rights of the human being, but at the collective level of the accountability of society. And for example, in a case in which Etienne and I have signed a petition a week ago of police violence causing the death of a person in France. It is not enough. It is necessary, but it is not enough to go after the police officer. It is necessary to go after the institution as well. But that's a difficult question. And to Bonnie's...
That's why I didn't sign the other petition in the same case, which did all sorts of right things, but in fact was uniquely and simply directed at targeting the police,
officer,
independent of the government and the whole state.
Sorry. And to Bonnie's 3 points. So first, I think the trend that I described is, you find it in Zimmel and others. It's, of course, as any, first of all, linear, and second, dualist representation. Of course, it's an oversimplification, obviously. But very interestingly, you bring Adam and Eve, and you bring the original sin. And sin as well. And I think that's very interesting because precisely I would make the argument, and I'm not the only one to do so, that Christian, and you even find that in Foucault, in fact, in the Punitive Society, in his courses at the Collège de France, that Christianity and the church have played a major role in this transformation from a moral economy based on exchange, punishment based on exchange, to a moral economy based on suffering and redemption and individual responsibility. And so I would say that that's a good element, but it would fit relatively well if we don't think that Adam and Eve were the first human beings in the world. And the second point, the Merchant of Venice is of course a remarkable example, and although he doesn't cite it, Nietzsche in the Genealogy of Morals exactly makes the foundation of this of the suffering precisely on the contract, and he said he plays on the game Schuld and Schulden, and he says that it's the contract in which to guarantee that the money will be given back, you have to promise something. Something can be a property, can be your wife, can be your children, can be yourself or part of yourself. So I think it is a crucial example, at least analytically. And finally, on street justice, I think that what you raise, and that's the same thing when I meet the Minister of the Interior, who is now the Prime Minister and who wants to be the President of France, Manuel Valls. He, at the end of the discussion we had, he took me apart and he said, well, the problem is the unions. You know, we cannot transform it. It's the problem of the police is the unions. Of course, since he didn't try, he didn't find any obstacle, because the minimum is to try to find, to encounter obstacle. But you're right that there's a form of paradox that the police would be as a union, as you rightly mentioned. If I may briefly ask two questions to Jay, very briefly. So first, you started by saying we are watching the death of human rights, but that was also what Hannah Arendt in the 1950s. So how is it a death, or is it getting worse? And the second point, I'm not sure whether it's, but what you said about the power to remove, based on Etienne, the power to remove the status of human rests in the exclusion or destruction. Do you see it on the side of the victim or on the side of the perpetrator? Because the argument could be that it's not by removing, I mean, it's the act of removing rather than the situation of being removed that would involve the dehumanization.
So as I guess perhaps the only person in this room is Peter Osborne, who would know that the last time I wrote on rights was about 30 years ago on Marx's Jewish question, where although I said Marx was kinder to rights than other people acknowledged, I took it that the notion of human rights was absurd. And thought so pretty much up until this summer when I reread my friend's works. So, so of course, so I had Sam's view all along. And so what's changed? And it really comes to how one heard Didier's paper. I heard his paper as giving all the evidence I needed for the position I was defending. That is, I heard him as saying, here are case after case after case in which we are appalled, and I want to know what we are appalled about. And I think if we are not going to go to Kantian fantasies or theological fantasies or other kinds of fantasies, then we are appalled that some idea of the human status is what is trampled upon in these cases, and that therefore, so then the question is, how is it even possible for your question to arise? And I think the answer to that is, of course, that human rights is a politically contested concept. And part of that political contestation, there are at least two essential other views. That most people who believe in human rights believe that they are moral possessions that people have simply in virtue of being human, and hence are, right, permanent and indestructible, i.e. they're anti-political ideas. And that's what most human rights theorists think. They're all the Griffin crew, and you know. The other, and by the way, that is how the traditional rights of man have been read, right? As individual rights that people have independently of political society, against political society, et cetera, et cetera. So, and the second view, which goes along with a positivist theory of law, is that rights are political instruments. Well, it's very possible to talk about rights in the sense you were criticizing me with as invoking both those thoughts, but not invoking the notion of rights that is premised on the idea of equidignity and equiliberty. And therefore, one in which it is experimental, political, and apolitical project that has as its point of intervention not the existence of rights, but the existence of their absence. That the negative ethical moment is what drives this. And if it's not the negative ethical moment in the work of determinate negation, then it's not a political project, then it's morality. So yeah, there is a contest, a political contest about rights, and I'm suggesting that if we believe in what I'm calling human rights, then that has to become a certain kind of political project, both reclaiming the concept and reclaiming, right, acting in response. And therefore, all I meant, right, that our moment is exactly like Arendt's moment. So whether we're in a cycle or perpetual or right, but the act of dehumanization is, of course, comes from, not from the victim, but the perpetrator, in his great work on Lando Patterson asks the question, how is it that slaves had a sense of dignity? And he gave the right and correct answer. Every slave had a mother. That their relationship to the slave owner was not their only relation in the world, that there are other sources of worth, and therefore we can experience the deprivation of our worth. And, okay. Yes, just stop there.
So I hate to shut it down for now, but we're at the end of our time